Today we're going to be talking about differentiated pathways, including all students with disabilities in the Colorado READ Act. This is Ellen Hunter, Literacy Specialist with the Exceptional Student Services Unit at the Colorado Department of Education. These are CDE's strategic goals. Every student, every step of the way. Starting strong in preschool, building language and readiness, reading by third grade by assuring that each student has the skills they need to be proficient by the end of third grade, meeting or exceeding the standards from third through being ready to graduate ready. The basic questions for today's webinar included: what are the changes to the READ Act for some students with disabilities? Who should be concerned about these changes? When do these changes take effect? How many students does this change affect? And why have these changes come about? Let's look at this first question. What are the changes to the Colorado READ Act for some students with disabilities? The most important change is that we are now including all students, including those previously exempted. We hope to capture all students with disabilities previously missing, exempted, or excluded from the Colorado READ collection. Who should be concerned about these changes? Both general education staff and special education staff need to be involved in this change. Those collecting the READ Act data, as well as those entering READ Act data, need to be aware of these changes and the subsequent changes to the collection codes, which will begin in the spring of 2016. When do these changes take effect? We are training on this change now in anticipation of the spring 2016 READ data collection, which will open on April 1st. How many students will be affected by this change? Let's look at READ collection data from the past 2 years. What you're seeing now is data from 2014. It is now almost 2 years old. If you look at the graph, you will see that in the spring of 2014, 425 or 2% of learners were exempted due to disability status. 778 or 3% of our learners were anticipated to be eligible for alternative assessment status and were therefore exempted. All total, 1,792 students, or 8% of our K-3 students with disabilities, were exempted. The next two lines show the number of students with disabilities found to either have or not have an SRD, a significant reading deficiency. Of all the students with disabilities, 53% were found not to have a significant reading deficiency, while 47%, which is 9,692 students, were found to have an SRD. The bottom line in green represents the number of students who are neither coded as exempted or excluded from the READ Act collection, but are in grades K through 3, have an active IEP, and were missing from the data collection. Altogether, these learners accounted for 1,387 students. The following year, in 2015, the same trend appears to be true. 1,454 students, or 66% of learners, were exempted due to disability or attendance status. 558, a little bit over 2% of learners, were anticipated to be eligible for alternative assessment and working on alternative standards. Altogether, 2,100 of 220 students with disabilities, or 9%, were exempted from participation in the READ Act. In 2015, 54% of the students screened with disabilities were found not to have a significant reading deficiency, while 9,591, or 45%, that were screened were found to have a significant reading deficiency. Our rate of missing students from the collection was a bit lower in 2015, falling at 1,267. Here's a big picture of the 2015 data for students with disabilities. Altogether, 23,132 students were reported or screened. That's approximately 94.8%. We are looking to include 100% of students with disabilities in the READ Act, so we have a little bit less than 6% to find and report this year. So why have these changes come about? We're now going to talk about a tale of three paths. Here is the opening paragraph from the actual Colorado READ Act, House Bill 1238, the Colorado Reading to Ensure Academic Development Act. In the opening legislative declaration, it states, all students can succeed in school if they have the foundational skills necessary for academic success. Notice at the beginning it refers to all students. The READ Act is for all students, including those students with disabilities. The Colorado Attorney General has confirmed that the READ Act is for every child in kindergarten through third grade. The READ Act legislation is for all general education students. We must remember that students receiving special education services are general education learners first. Special education is a supplement to general education. The presence or suspicion of a disability does not warrant a child to be exempted or excluded from the Colorado READ Act. This would be a violation of the child's 504 rights. With this change comes a number of challenges. To determine a significant reading deficiency, SRD, each child must be screened using a CDE-approved interim instrument. The challenge is that not every child can be screened for an SRD with the existing tools as a result of accessibility issues. The approved tools are not normed for all learners with disabilities. Some learners may require an alternate or differentiated pathway to be screened for the presence of a significant reading deficiency when the approved interim assessments cannot be used with allowable accommodations. Which students with disabilities are we talking about? What's important to remember is we're talking about some, but not all students with visual impairment, including blindness, hearing impairment, including deafness, speech or language impairment. This should be a small category of students who have difficulty with oral fluency or are more nonverbal. It also includes some but not all students with traumatic brain injury, some but not all students with autism spectrum disorder, some students with intellectual disabilities or multiple disabilities, students that fall under the category of deaf blindness, or students with serious emotional disability. Why find a differentiated pathway and include all students with disabilities? First and foremost, it shines a spotlight on the reading abilities of all students, and particularly in this case of all K-3 students. For those determined to have an SRD, it provides a specific reading intervention focus. Without such interventions, reading potential may be minimized or even lost. And last but not least, to distribute READ Act or pupil funds equitably to all students identified with a significant reading deficiency, including students with disabilities. So what are the changes? First, we're including all students with disabilities in the READ Act. Those involved in implementing the READ Act need to be informed. This includes all school administrators, assessment coordinators, general education teachers, and special education teachers. And the change is going to go into effect during the next READ Act data collection. The window opens on April 1st, 2016. This has been our journey to today. First, we identified the barriers to the inclusion of all students with disabilities in the READ Act. Next, we began collaborative discussions with the CDE Office of Literacy. Then we took the challenge to the field and, using the expertise and guidance of our disability-specific advisory groups, began to formulate a plan that included a number of differentiated pathways. We began meeting with researchers and external experts who have been very helpful in the process, specifically around Pathway 3 options. These external researchers and experts have included Karen Erickson from the University of Northern Carolina, Dr. Brenda Schick and her team from the University of Colorado. And when we started talking about a BRAILLE form of the DIBELS, we worked with Dr. Roland Good and Dr. Ruth Kaminsky from the University of Oregon. We began talking with other states about how they were planning to include students in their third grade guarantee laws. 34 of 50 states currently have a law similar to the Colorado READ Act. We then formulated an Exceptional Student Services Unit internal task force that began to develop and organize our alternative and differentiated pathways so that all students with disabilities could be included in this next collection. Subsequently, we had discussions with our state director's leadership team and took their feedback and helped use it to formulate our final pathways. Our discussions and collaborations led us to 3 paths, but first we're going to look at the READ Act itself. We're going to look at an overview of the READ Act and assessments, READ plans and IEPs, and then we'll look specifically at the differentiated pathways and the approved assessments and accommodations. And then we're going to finish up with READ Act reporting. The READ Act was passed by the Colorado legislature in 2012. It was a repeal of the Colorado Basic Literacy Act. The Colorado READ Act focuses on K-3 literacy development and direct support to students that are identified with a significant reading deficiency. The READ Act also includes specific guidance regarding literacy assessments and individual intervention plans for students identified with an SRD. The READ Act also contains requirements for parent communication and involvement. It holds districts and schools accountable for student progress through the Unified Improvement Plan process. It also includes provisions for retention decisions for students completing K-3 with a significant reading deficiency beginning in the 2013 school year. However, the goal of the READ Plan is not to be as a retention act, but to be a prevention act. It provides funding to support intervention. The READ Act requires teachers to assess the literacy development of students in K-3 in the areas of phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary development, including oral skills, reading fluency, and reading comprehension. The assessments for making the instructional decisions have been decided upon and approved at the state level. They are used because educators need to make frequent decisions regarding instruction for all students. They can be used to maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of those decisions, and it's important that those decisions be accurate and based on data. The ultimate goal is to improve outcomes for all students by planning effective instruction from the use of that data. So the READ Act assessments for students with disabilities who were previously exempted from the READ Act. What is our system-wide plan for support? What is our plan for each student? Are students making adequate progress? Are they progressing toward their literacy goals? And is each student receiving support making adequate progress? These were the questions we began to ask ourselves as we began to design the pathways. Here is a graphic that shows the annual READ Act timelines. It shows when students in the early fall should be assessed for the identification of a significant reading deficiency. It also shows when, in the spring, that data is collected, and based on the number of students, the state distributes READ intervention funds to districts sometime during the late summer months. READ Act assessments are called interim assessments. They are given to all students at the beginning of the year as a screener and throughout the year to progress monitor. The assessments chosen and approved by the state serve as the screening tools for the early identification. They're designed to measure foundational skills for early literacy, and they offer progress monitoring throughout the year. There's a number of variations in the approved interim assessments. Some are administered individually, while others can be administered as a group assessment. Some are computer adaptive, while others are curriculum-based measurement tools. When determining a significant reading deficiency, students are screened initially within the first 30 days of school, using one of the state-approved assessments. Based on the outcome of that screening, students are determined to either have an SRD or to not have an SRD. For each interim assessment approved by the state, there is a cut score. The confirmation of an SRD is determined by whether the student's score on the selected interim assessment falls below the cut score. Here we are again at the annual READ Act timelines, again looking at the fall when all students are screened. Subsequently, students are identified as having an SRD or not having an SRD based on the cut score on the approved interim assessment being used as a screening tool. In the spring, districts assess students again and submit the data on numbers of students identified with SRD for funding, and then the state distributes READ intervention funds to the district. The Colorado READ Act requires that a READ plan must be developed for all students in grades K through 3 who are determined to have a significant reading deficiency. You will see on the slide a statement that is found in the actual legislation. It states, if a student is identified as having a disability that impacts the student's progress in developing reading skills, the local education provider shall, as appropriate, integrate into the student's individual education program intervention, instruction, and strategies to address the student's reading issues in lieu of a READ plan. It is a local decision whether or not a READ plan and an IEP should be blended or kept separately. AUs, administrative units, must approach each and every student's general and special education needs on a case-by-case basis, considering the student's individual needs, abilities, and circumstances. For questions about how a specific student's READ plan could or should interact with his or her IEP, the AU should consult with his legal counsel. A link is provided on this slide to a guidance document providing guidance about students with disabilities, READ plans, and IEPs. Districts are reminded that the determination of whether or not IEPs and READ plans should be integrated or completed separately is determined at the local level. Teachers having questions about this issue are encouraged to contact their director of special ed. Some administrative units or school districts may elect to consistently keep READ plans and IEPs separate as a matter of policy. Building administrators and team members should consult with their special ed coordinators and directors, as well as their legal counsel as needed, to ensure their actions are aligned with the policy in their AU or district. Now we're going to talk about our paths to including all students with disabilities in the Colorado READ Plan and READ Act. The first rule of thumb is to always try and use the approved interim assessment that is typically administered in your AU or your district. So now we're going to look at the first two pathways. Pathway number 1. A student with a disability can access the district-wide approved interim assessment, either with or without approved assessment accommodations. Pathway number 2. A student with a disability cannot access the approved district-wide interim assessment, but instead can access another state-approved interim assessment. Here is a list of the approved interim assessments. There are 7 assessments on this list. Note at the bottom, DRA2 and Dibble's 6th edition are currently in use but will be discontinued after July 1st, 2016. The 7 assessments include Ames-Webb, the Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, the 7th edition or Next edition, Dibble's Next, the Formative Assessment System for Teachers, FAST, iReady, iStation, the Phonological Awareness Literacy Screening, PALS, and STAR Early Learning. All interim assessments must be given with the assessment approved accommodations only. If your district approved assessment is a 1-minute time measure and extended time is not outlined as an accommodation through the assessment, then you cannot give extended time in this assessment or you invalidate the results. IEPs may outline accommodations that are not permissible on your approved assessment, which is why you will have to access another state-approved assessment if that might work better for some students. Again, the important point here to remember is that assessment-approved accommodations are not the same as IEP accommodations. Here's a graph that shows the approved accommodations for Dibble's Next. On one side, you can see the approved accommodations include the use of a marker or ruler to focus students' attention on the materials, or the use of colored overlays or filters or lighting adjustments for students with visual impairment, or the use of assistive technology for students with hearing impairment, or the enlargement of the font size into larger print for students with visual impairment. On the other side are examples of unapproved accommodations. They cannot be given untimed, or a student with limited English proficiency cannot be given the directions in his or her primary language. Here is the same format for the STAR Early Learning. The approved accommodations and examples of unapproved accommodations. iReady, an approved accommodation would be the ability to provide extended time limits for students who may need more time to process the questions and enter a response. However, the text of iReady should not be signed or read in a native language to students because it is an assessment of their ability to comprehend printed text. Ames-Webb includes approved accommodations such as enlarging the test form, repeating the spoken directions when introducing the actual test, and modifying the environment, including special lighting. However, you cannot extend the administration time students read the passages. You cannot provide feedback during administration beyond what is specified, and you cannot provide practice administrations. Pathway number 3. If a student is unable to take the typically administered assessment or any of the alternative state-approved assessments, then he or she is a student who should be considered for pathway number 3. Because the student is unable to access any of the approved interim assessments, teachers working with these students should look at the following 3 options to choose from. First is the Colorado Early Emergent Literacy Scales. The second is the BRAILLE options, and the third is the assessment battery for deaf and hard of hearing. The READ Act requires districts to report specific student, schools, and district-level data to the Colorado Department of Education in order for the department to determine the number of students identified with an SRD, a significant reading deficiency. Exemptions for students with disabilities that existed in the collection are no longer present. All students will be reported in the READ collection through the pipeline. Based on the reporting, students receive per pupil intervention funds. The Early Literacy Fund provides districts with per pupil funding to help fund programs to meet the needs of students with an identified significant reading deficiency. During the 2015-2016 school year, the per pupil allocation was $905.88. This amount will be different next year. Per pupil funds may be used to provide full-day kindergarten, scientifically or evidence-based interventions, including training for teachers to use those interventions, summer school, and tutorial services. So let's again review our 3 pathways. First pathway is the student is administered the school-selected interim assessment with any needed allowable accommodations. Pathway number 2 is the student takes another of the approved interim assessments that may be different from the school's typical interim assessment due to specific accessibility or response needs of the student. And finally, pathway number 3, using one of the 3 differentiated pathway options. Let's look at those 3 options again in pathway 3. The 3 options are available when neither path 1 or path 2 are appropriate for a specific student's needs. Option number 1 is a brailled form of Dibbles Next. Option number 2 is the new research-based procedure for hearing impaired. And 3 is the assessment of emergent literacy skills. Option 1 again is a BRAILLE option. Students requiring a BRAILLE format assessment will be screened using Dibbles in the new Unified English Braille, or UEB, format. A teacher of students with visual impairment, TVI, should be present for testing administration and for the analysis of the results. The BRAILLE format Dibbles will be provided to schools at no cost from the Colorado Instructional Materials Center, as ordered by the TVI working with the student. Option number 2. There will be a group of students with hearing impairment who cannot access the approved interim assessments. Based on research findings from the University of Colorado's grant to explore literacy for students with hearing loss, it is recommended that a limited number of subtests from the Woodcock-Johnson 4th edition Tests of Achievement be used to determine the presence of an SRD for this group of students. Rationale for this recommendation and identification of specific subtests will be shared with the field via a CDE webinar. An additional video will be available to demonstrate the administration of the Woodcock-Johnson 4th edition for sign-dependent students. And the third option in Pathway 3 is the Colorado Emergent Literacy Scales. The CEL scales are based on the Dynamic Learning Maps assessment and are to be used for students whose instruction is based on alternate achievement standards and EEOs. It is a developmentally appropriate, naturalistic approach to interim assessment
that includes a structured portfolio approach. During the spring of 2013, 2014, and 2015, READ Act data collections, students who could not be assessed with one of the approved interim assessments and were not COALT eligible were likely excluded, exempted, and unreported. During these same collection periods, students determined to be COALT eligible were also coded as exempt. During the next collection cycle, which begins in April of 2016, the exempt codes have been eliminated and replaced with a code signifying the use of a differentiated pathway for the determination of an SRD, significant reading deficiency. Here is a snapshot of the READ Act data collection sheet. You will notice down the side the number of numbers. Each number represents an actual interim assessment that might be used to screen a child. The number 13 represents special education students tested using an alternative approved measure or differentiated pathway. The codes for the READ Act collection have not changed significantly. Once you have identified what assessment or pathway you have used, then you're going to identify whether 1, the student does not have a significant reading deficiency, or 2, the student does have a significant reading deficiency. Thank you for joining us during this webinar. Further questions about the READ Act can be addressed to the Office of Literacy. The appropriate names and email addresses are included on this page. If you have specific questions about the READ Act and students with disabilities, please feel free to contact me at hunter_e@cde.state.co.us. Thank you for participating in this webinar.